Althea Patrice Johnson has always seen Washington/D.C. as a city of contradictions. A place built on ideals of freedom and democracy, but permeated with political intrigue and unspoken power struggles. As a senior policy advisor at the Pentagon, she was walking on thin ice. On the one hand, the desire to serve her country. On the other, the realization that her every move was subject to far more scrutiny than most, simply because she was a black woman. And yet, despite the challenges, she succeeded. Over the years, Althea earned a reputation as a driven and visionary strategist whose ideas resonated with the most senior military officials. In her 36 years, she possessed a confidence hidden behind calmness and poise. In the evenings, when the Pentagon corridors were empty, she often stayed late into the night, thinking up new strategies. That fall evening, she was on her way to dinner with an old friend, a U.S. Army colonel she'd met as a student at Howard University. Their meeting was to take place at a small bistro in Arlington. Althea drove a modest hybrid Ford Fusion, avoiding unnecessary ostentation despite her high status and not insignificant salary. She believed that true power didn't need ostentatious symbols of prestige. Her mother had always taught her to remain humble, to remember her roots and not forget what she had chosen this path for. As she drove, her thoughts returned to a past meeting where she presented a strategic plan to improve cybersecurity in the military. The leadership had praised her initiative, especially since the proposed measures could save millions of dollars in the budget. She had one more milestone ahead of her, a meeting with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin III, a man she deeply respected. His history, his steadfastness and dedication to principle were an inspiration to her. As Althea pulled onto the Jefferson Davis Highway, the red and blue lights of a patrol car flashed in her rearview mirror. She checked the speedometer. The speed was within the speed limit. Perhaps the police car was in a hurry to respond to a call. However, the patrol car did not overtake her, but instead lined up behind her, making it clear that she was the target. Her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. There was no cause for alarm, but life had taught her that situations like this could spiral out of control in an instant. Turning on her turn signal, she carefully readjusted and pulled off to the side of the road. In her side mirror, she saw two officers emerge from the patrol car. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with an Officer Denton patch. The other was stocky, with a shaved head and unkempt stubble, and his uniform read Officer Pratt. Their silhouettes stretched out in the light of the headlights, and the beams of the flashlights ran across her license plate. Althea rolled down her window and put her hands on the steering wheel, showing complete openness. Her mother had instilled caution in her from childhood, and her years in the military had only reinforced her discipline. "Good evening, officer," she said in a steady, polite voice, carefully controlling her tone. "License and registration," Denton tossed briefly, his face remaining impenetrable behind his dark glasses despite the late hour. "Of course," she replied, smoothly pulling the papers from her purse and glove compartment. She handed the papers to the officer, expecting the standard check. However, instead of walking straight away with them to the patrol car, Denton lingered, scrutinizing her intently. There was a strange tension. Something was wrong. "Step out of the car," he finally said. Althea felt her insides tighten. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked calmly, though an alarm was already ringing inside her. We'll figure it out, he replied and took a step back, his hand sliding to his holster. Fear and confusion swirled in her mind. As early as this morning, she was sitting at a table in the Pentagon discussing national security issues. Tomorrow, she was to present her draft to the Secretary of Defense. Now she stood on the curb and in front of two police officers, not realizing what she'd gotten herself into. But she complied. Slowly unbuckling her seatbelt, she opened the door and stepped out. A chill ran through the cold night air, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. She had no idea that this seemingly routine traffic incident would start a chain of events that would turn her life upside down, blow up the judicial system, and shake the highest echelons of government. Pratt, meanwhile, took her ID and went back to the patrol car to check it out. Denton stared at her intently. "Hands on the hood," he ordered. Her fingers clenched into a fist. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. Althea froze, barely suppressing her astonishment. She was a law-abiding citizen, not a fugitive criminal. There was no reason for such aggression, but she knew one night in custody, if it came to that, was still safer than trying to resist. She gingerly placed her palms on the hood. Officer Denton began a perfunctory search, his movements rough, at times bordering on outright discomfort. Althea clenched her teeth, maintaining her equanimity, just as she did in military briefings when she had to prove a point in front of the generals. To show fear or anger now would make matters worse. Meanwhile, Officer Pratt was checking her data over the radio. His voice was muffled by interference, but Althea picked up a few key phrases. No criminal record, driver's license valid, no wanted. Her heart beat faster. They had to let her go, right? Denton finished the search and straightened up, glancing over to his partner. Pratt handed back the documents, but his face remained tense. "All clear," he muttered with a disgruntled expression. "But there's something we need to check." "What is it?" Althea tried to keep her voice steady, but irritation was already boiling up inside. They had no legitimate reason to detain her. Denton ignored the question and headed to the passenger side of her car, shining a flashlight inside. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes," Althea replied. "Meeting a coworker for dinner. Would you like his number? He'll confirm what I said." But Denton didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door, Ahmed looked inside, and began rummaging through his belongings. At that moment, Pratt walked around the car and stopped at the trunk. "Open it," he ordered, tapping the lid with his flashlight. Althea's throat was dry. This was getting out of hand. "I can open it, but I want to know why," she said firmly. "I'm not consenting to a search, but I'm not resisting." She remembered the advice from legal seminars. Verbal refusal of consent was okay, but physical resistance was dangerous. The trunk lock clicked, the lid lifted. Pratt shone his flashlight on her things, a neatly folded sports backpack, a tool kit, a spare tire. He rummaged through the bag and pulled out a pair of sneakers, an athletic pants, or a bottle of water, and a ragged copy of the book Duty. Memories of the Secretary of Defense by Robert Gates. Ironic that the book belonged to the man who himself had once run the Pentagon. Pratt slammed the trunk shut with noticeable irritation. Clear, but Denton's expression only darkened, as if he were disappointed. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you?" He finally spoke. Althea took a deep breath. "No, officer." I wasn't speeding. Oh, watch. My papers are in order. Maybe my taillight's not working. Denton hesitated. We received a call about a suspicious vehicle in the area. Your car matches the description. Althea barely held back a chuckle. Suspicious vehicle is a silver Ford Fusion. That description could fit half the sedans on the road. But there was no point in arguing. Now that you've checked my papers, can I get my things and move on? She asked, nodding at the purse left on the driver's seat. Denton nodded grudgingly. Althea walked around the car, picked up the bag, and carefully tucked the license into her purse. At that moment, Pratt's walkie-talkie came to life again. His posture changed. His face tensed. Dispatch says to take her to the station, he announced. Althea froze. On what grounds? She wheezed. But there was no answer. Denton grabbed her arm, slammed it sharply behind her back, and cuffed her. A sharp pain pierced her shoulder. Tears of shock flashed in her eyes, but she blinked, suppressing them. That's impossible. You're under arrest, Pratt said in a flat voice, not bothering to explain the details. Something about a connection to some sort of incident in the area earlier in the evening. It was too vague to sound convincing. Althea wanted to object, to assert her rights, to shout that she was a high-ranking Pentagon official, but stopped herself in time. She knew that such statements rarely worked in her favor. Right now, the most important thing was to keep her composure and safety. As she was placed in the patrol car, the world around her seemed to shake. Her mother's words about how dangerous these situations could be came to mind. She remembered her father, who had instilled in her a love of military service. Remembered the countless hours spent building a career in a defense field that didn't always favor the likes of her. And now she sat in handcuffs as the patrol car whisked her away into the unknown. Inside the police station, the air was thick with tension. The harsh light of the lamps beat into her eyes, and the echo of footsteps echoed through the sterile corridors. Althea felt the metal handcuffs digging into her wrists, leaving an unpleasant, crushing pain. In the car, they tried to ask her questions several times, but she answered with restraint, demanding to know the reason for her detention. The officers, however, as only remained silent, averting their gazes and continuing to insist on a protocol. At the police station, she was immediately taken to the detainee registration area. A bright flash blinded her for a second, an ID photo. Althea forced herself not to blink, not to show emotion, though humiliation flared up inside like a flame. Then the fingerprinting procedure, after which she was led into a small stone cubbyhole with a long bench and a dim bulb under the ceiling. She waited. She knew that every hour lost here played against her. Tomorrow morning, she was to present the final cybersecurity project to the Pentagon's top brass. She was a key developer of the initiative, her name already sounding like a rising star in the corridors of power. But if news of the detention leaked out, the consequences could be unpredictable. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed and footsteps were heard. A minute later, a short detective with a wrinkled shirt and tired eyes stood in front of her. Detective Rowland. He introduced himself, gesturing to a chair across from her. Althea sat down with her arms crossed over her chest, looking straight at him. She wasn't going to beg or make excuses. The detective flipped through the folder, lazily running his finger along the lines. You say you work for the government? He asked, raising an eyebrow skeptically. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Pentagon, she replied in a steady voice. I have the highest level of clearance. I'm authorized to make one call. Roland hummed, glanced at Officers Denton and Pratt, who were standing by the door. All right. Just answer me first. Where were you between 8 and 9 o'clock tonight? Altia held back a frustrated sigh. I left the Pentagon around 8, headed for Arlington. I have a GPS log on my phone that will confirm that. As soon as I'm authorized to use it, we can close this matter. Roland shook his head. Here's the thing, Miss Johnson, period. At the same time, there was an armed robbery nearby. Cameras captured a black woman driving away in a silver sedan. Your car is a silver sedan. That's absurd, Altia said quietly but firmly. Do you realize that there are hundreds of such cars? I had nothing to do with it. The detective continued to watch her, drumming his fingers on the table. We'll look at the camera footage and cross-reference it. But for now, in the meantime, you're holding an innocent man. There was a note of steel in Altia's voice. That's a violation of my rights. I demand a phone call. Roland held her gaze for a moment, then nodded briefly to Pratt. The officer led her out into the corridor and brought her to the telephone. The machine was old, with a massive receiver and yellowed buttons. Altia dialed the number of Colonel Stephen McKnight / her immediate superior. The dial tone dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Finally, a hoarse, sleepy voice came from the other end of the line. Colonel McKnight. Colonel, this is Altia Johnson. Her voice was calm but tense. I'm at the Arlington station. I was arrested by mistake. Suspicion of armed robbery. They won't let me prove who I am. There was silence on the other side. Then came a clear, curt reply. Stay where you are. I'll handle this. Altia hung up the phone and took a deep breath. She knew that everything would change now. The only question was, how quickly? She was returned to her cell. Time stretched slowly. Her thoughts raced chaotically. What if the evidence wasn't available in time? What if she had to spend the whole night here? Again and again she replayed in her mind the meeting that now hung in jeopardy. But somewhere in the back of her mind she knew this story was far from over. Conversations came from somewhere far away, and the phone rang intermittently, and each time Altia hoped it was Colonel McKnight calling the station to straighten things out. But no one came with either a release or new information. The weight of injustice pressed down on her. Despite her high status, she felt like a prisoner of the absurd, as in some Kafka nightmare. In this silent chamber, Altia realized this was not just a misunderstanding. It was a collision of bias, bureaucracy, and banal bad luck. But she gave herself her word that this ordeal would not break her. If everything went right, she would walk out of here tomorrow with her head held high, and the officers who had treated her so carelessly would face the consequences of their actions. By the time dawn broke, Altia had hardly slept a wink. She was tormented by the cold of the metal bench, the harsh light of the fluorescent bulbs, and the smell of cheap disinfectant. She had lost track of the time that had passed since her arrest. Occasionally, officers passed by, glimpsed into the cell, but didn't say a word. Finally, shortly after sunrise, the cell door swung open. Detective Roland stood in the doorway, looking a little uncertain. "Follow me," he said briefly. Altia stood up, feeling every tense muscle in her body protest. Roland led her to another interrogation room, a small, windowless room with a bare desk and 2 chairs. Inside, Colonel Stephen McKnight was waiting for her. He was in civilian clothes, but his posture, his facial expression, everything spoke of unyielding military discipline. He examined her closely, obviously checking to see if she had been harmed. "Althea, are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though she felt very differently. Roland coughed. "Colonel McKnight has checked your credentials. We're still reconciling some of the details. I've already confirmed Ms. Johnson's identity and her position at the Pentagon." McKnight interrupted him sharply. "She has the highest level of TSSCI clearance. Entry and exit logs for the Pentagon confirm she was there until 8 o'clock this evening. Security cameras recorded her departure." Roland scratched the back of his head. "Yes, Horace, Colonel, but we have a suspect matching the description of..." "Description?" McKnight gritted his teeth. "A lazy guess. That's what it is." He put a puffy folder on the table. "Here's the surveillance footage from the store. I made sure they got them this morning. The suspect is wearing completely different clothes. Her car is a different model and color. She's not even the same height as Althea Johnson." Roland flipped through the pages, his defensive stance replaced by confusion. Althea watched him, catching every change in his expression. She could feel the tension hovering in the air. McKnight was furious, and justifiably so. "Colonel," Roland finally spoke, choosing his words carefully, "we are making the necessary checks, but we must realize that we were acting on reliable information." "Reliable?" McKnight repeated with an icy grin. "Or just convenient? Look, we both know what happened here. But know one thing, Ms. Johnson will be fully exonerated, and I will personally see to it that this incident is not without consequences." Althea took a deep breath and finally spoke herself. "How long will it take for me to officially leave here?" Roland averted his eyes. "We've asked the store owner to come in for identification. If he confirms it's not you, Ida, we'll let you go. But we have to follow procedures." "Procedures?" McKnight repeated sarcastically. "That's fine. We'll wait. But rest assured, I'm not just going to leave it at that." A few minutes later, they were invited into another room. Behind the glass sat the store owner, a haggard man with a tired look in his eyes. Detective Roland gestured for Althea to step forward. The man stared at her, his brow furrowed. "It's not her," he said confidently. "The woman who had attacked me was shorter, larger, and had braids. And she was dressed very differently." Althea closed her eyes, holding back a sigh of relief. The tension in her shoulders eased. Roland looked as if he wanted the earth to open beneath him. "Are you sure?" he asked again, as if hoping for a different answer. "Absolutely," the owner said. "I don't know why she was detained, but it's a mistake." There was silence. McKnight exhaled noisily, his anger hanging almost palpably in the air. Althea shifted her gaze to Roland, waiting for some explanation. "Miss Johnson," he finally said, gritting his teeth, "it appears there's been a mistake. As soon as the paperwork is complete, you're free to go." "A mistake?" McKnight repeated coldly. "Gross negligence, I'd say." Within minutes, Althea had signed the papers and her personal belongings were returned to her. Holding her cell phone in her hands, she noticed fresh scratches on the case. It had probably been carelessly tossed during the search. The business card holder was bent. As she tucked the phone into her bag, Her gaze caught Officers Denton and Pratt standing in the far corner of the precinct. Denton met her gaze, his face remaining stony. Then he looked away. Pratt on the other hand was strenuously pretending to be busy with paperwork. Once they were outside, McKnight turned to Althea. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. Althea breathed in the fresh morning air. The sun seemed particularly bright, but her thoughts were already preoccupied with other things. How many calls had she missed? How many rumors could she spread? At the Pentagon meeting tomorrow, when she entered the room, someone would already know what had happened. Even though she was completely exonerated, the mud of doubt always remained. In their world, an accusation was remembered longer than an acquittal. "Personally, I will see to it that these officers are held accountable. You deserve better. Our country deserves better from those who swear to protect it." Althea smiled weakly, feeling grateful and tired. "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate everything you've done this morning. I just want to forget this nightmare and get back to work." McKnight nodded. "I'll arrange for a car to take you home. Get some rest. Change your clothes. I want to see you in my office by noon. The Secretary of Defense's staff already called me while I was on the road. They're waiting for your final cybersecurity recommendations." Althea blinked, trying to switch from the horror she'd experienced to the world of high stakes and government decisions. "I'll be there," she said, determination in her voice despite the fatigue that had accumulated. They separated, and as they settled into the back seat of the company sedan, Althea felt a storm of emotions in her chest: relief, rage, gratitude, exhaustion. Looking out the window at the streets of Washington, she wondered how long it would take for her life to return to normal. And would it be possible now? What she didn't know yet was that this story had only just begun. Her fight for justice was just gaining momentum. The days leading up to the preliminary hearing merged into an uninterrupted series of interrogations, legal consultations, and an unexpected media barrage. Althea had hoped the case could be settled quietly, in the offices of lawyers and judges, but a savvy reporter from the Washington Post caught the scoop: the Pentagon counselor was suing the police. The headlines hit the news in a flash. When Althea first stepped onto the courthouse steps, she was greeted by a throng of reporters. "Miss Johnson, what do you make of the allegations of racial discrimination? Is it true that you are a high-ranking Pentagon official? Have you discussed this case with the Secretary of Defense?" Althea looked away from the camera flashes, walking surrounded by her lawyer, Camille Webster, and Colonel McKnight. Webster, an experienced lawyer, reflected the questions with a short sentence: "No comment. We will make a statement in due course." The air in the courthouse was cool with the smell of old coffee. Althea clenched her hands into fists, preparing for a new challenge. The trial began with the reading of the charges: illegal search, false arrest, violation of civil rights. Althea, sitting at the prosecution table, was barely breathing as she listened to Prosecutor Renee Faulkner articulate her case. "The evidence indicates that Miss Johnson was detained without probable cause. Her car was searched in violation of the Fourth Amendment, and the arrest itself was made under false pretenses. We intend to prove that the actions of Officers Denton and Pratt exceeded their authority and harmed her reputation and well-being." Defense counsel parried. The officers received operational information and acted in the midst of an investigation. Their actions were not malicious, just part of standard police procedure. Judge Pamela Winston listened intently to both sides, adjusting her thin glasses on the bridge of her nose, then tapped her pencil on her desk. I want all the evidence in my office by the end of the week. Ms. Johnson, Officers Denton and Pratt, you will be required to testify under oath. This court is adjourned. 2 weeks later, the main trial began. Aaliyah arrived at court each morning in perfectly tailored suits, projecting confidence despite her nervous tension. There were whispers in the court corridors, flashes of press credentials, and the occasional appearance of protesters and activists, some supporting her, others seeing political overtones in the case. On the first day of the trial, Aaliyah took a seat on the witness stand. The room was full, with cameras at the back, allowed only to film certain parts of the trial. Judge Winston kept a close eye on order. Prosecutor Faulkner approached a witness. Miss Johnson, tell us in your own words what happened that night. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her palms moist with tension. She started at the beginning, leaving the Pentagon, the flashing lights in the mirror, the order to get out of the car, the search, the arrest. Every detail, the feeling of the officer's fingers squeezing her hand, the silent intimidation on Pratt's part sounded clear and crisp. There was silence in the hall. Everyone listened to every word she said. What did you feel at that moment? Faulkner asked. Altia looked up at the jury, preparing to answer. Altia took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I was scared, she said, her voice trembling for the first time in a while. I knew I was innocent, but I also realized how quickly situations like this can escalate into something scary. Especially if you're a dark-skinned woman and there are police officers standing in front of you who have already decided you're guilty. A few jurors nervously squirmed in their seats. Someone nodded faintly. Then it was the turn of cross-examination. The defense counsel, a wiry, self-assured man with an unchanging sneer on his lips, leaned forward. Miss Johnson, you claim to have cooperated with the police. But isn't it true that you hesitated when you were ordered out of the car? Altia tensed, but kept her composure. I hesitated because I was confused. It was an unexpected demand, but I complied. The DVR footage will prove it. And yet you accused the officers of racial bias. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. Perhaps they were simply following standard procedures in responding to a call that came in. I'm not denying that the initial stop was related to the tip, and Altia replied. But the subsequent actions, the search without authorization, the arrest without evidence, show bias and disregard for my rights. Defense counsel continued to insist, insinuating that Altia had taken advantage of her position at the Pentagon to manipulate the situation. But she firmly objected. I only mentioned my position when I realized that my attempts to explain myself were being completely ignored. When her questioning was over, Altia left the witness stand with her heart racing. There was a tense silence in the room as people absorbed what they had heard, realizing that her story went far beyond a single night of injustice. The next days in court were spent in a series of high-profile testimonies. A forensic expert presented a DVR tape showing Altia calmly getting out of the car, refuting the officer's claim that she resisted. Homeland Security investigators uncovered the facts. Denton had a history of complaints of excessive force, albeit without consequences. Pratt had fewer such marks, but he wasn't blameless either. The biggest scandal came midway through the trial when prosecutors introduced a new witness, Denton's former partner, who had retired 2 years earlier. He admitted under oath that he repeatedly heard Denton make racist remarks, including threats to teach black drivers a lesson. The defense attorney vehemently objected, but the judge allowed the testimony to be heard. Indignant cheers erupted in the audience. Denton turned pale, and Pratt did not take his eyes off the floor. When Denton himself took a seat on the stand, his confidence began to crack at the seams. Under the prosecutor's tough questions, he became confused about his own words, contradicting his own testimony several times. At one point, he claimed that the suspect's license plate matched Altia's car, but the prosecutor immediately presented evidence to the contrary. Pratt seemed less confident than usual, trying to shift the blame to Denton. Under the prosecutor's pressure, however, he admitted that he had not personally seen Altia do anything suspicious. He had simply trusted his partner's word. By the end of the day, the defense looked visibly shaken. The picture was becoming clear. Altia was an innocent woman wrongfully arrested, and Denton was a police officer systematically abusing his power. When Altia walked out of the courtroom, she was immediately surrounded by a crowd of journalists. The camera flashes were blinding, and questions poured in from all sides. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. But there were still closing arguments to come. Meanwhile, on the sidelines, another drama was unfolding. The defense, desperate to break Altia in court, switched to her professional past. Rumor had it that they were digging into her background, trying to find something compromising. Financial statements, levels of access to classified information, even old social media postings. One evening, as Altia was leaving the courthouse with attorney Camille Webster, an unfamiliar man approached them and shoved a folder in their hands. "You might want to take a look at this," he muttered, and immediately disappeared into the crowd. Inside were copies of official documents, not classified, but sensitive enough that leaking them would be a problem. In the margins, someone scribbled, "We can release this to the press if you don't withdraw the lawsuit." Altia felt everything go cold inside. This was pure intimidation. "This is blatant pressure," Webster exhaled furiously. "We must report it to the judge and the prosecutor's office immediately." But Altia hesitated. "If we make it public, it could jeopardize national security. Plus, the defense will immediately spin it as if I broke the rules myself. That could ruin the whole process." "That's why we shouldn't let them intimidate us," Webster said firmly. "We have to be honest with the court. Let the judge decide how to proceed." The next day, a new scandal erupted in court. The prosecutor presented new evidence, correspondence between Denton and Pratt just after Altia's arrest. In the messages, Denton openly mocked her, calling her an arrogant official and asserting that she should have been taught a lesson. The trial came to a climax when new evidence came to light in the courtroom. Messages sent by Denton Pratt after Ali's arrest were a bombshell. In them, the officer spoke with undisguised contempt of cocky-costumed smartasses, believing that a night in a cell would teach her respect. There was a deafening silence in the courtroom, punctuated only by occasional sighs. Even the defense attorney looked stunned. That evening, after the hearing, Denton's attorney approached Ali outside the courthouse with a strained smile. "Ms. Johnson, I'm sure we'll be in touch with you soon. You may want to discuss settlement terms." Aaliyah looked at him with cold contempt, feeling indignation boiling up inside her. "It's not a question of money," she said firmly. "It is a question of responsibility." The lawyer turned pale and hastily retreated. The next day, the court went into closing arguments. There was a tense expectation in the room. Ada Faulkner addressed the jury in a confident, steady voice. "This case is not just a mistaken road search. It is an example of a systemic problem that demands accountability. Officers Denton and Pratt acted not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of bias. They humiliated a respected citizen by violating her basic rights. I urge you to choose justice and find them guilty." Defense counsel attempted to play one last card. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, everyone makes mistakes. Denton and Pratt were under pressure because of the gunman orientation. Their judgment may have been flawed, but were their actions intentionally discriminatory? We submit that they were not. These officers served the public good every day." But his words sounded pale, especially against the backdrop of Denton's correspondence. The defense attorney clearly felt the case was already slipping out of his hands. When the jury retired to deliberate, there was a tense silence in the room. The wait lasted for hours. Aaliyah paced the hallway, occasionally peering into the crowd awaiting the verdict. Denton and Pratt sat in the corner with their attorney Fao, their faces frozen in tension. Finally, the judge returned to the room and the foreman of the jury rose. "We, the jury, find officers Thomas Denton and Mark Pratt guilty of unlawful detention, civil rights violations, and racial discrimination. We recommend appropriate penalties." The courtroom filled with sighs of relief and quiet applause. Aaliyah felt tears come to her eyes, tears of relief, of justice, but also of bitterness for the system that had allowed this to happen. The judge tapped her gavel, calling for order. "Officers Denton and Pratt, the court finds you guilty of all charges. Sentencing will take place next week. This court is adjourned." As soon as the judge left the room, some chaos ensued. Reporters rushed to Ali, blinding her with camera flashes. "Ms. Johnson, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you be seeking further action? What does the Pentagon think?" Ali raised her hand for silence, then spoke in a firm voice. "I am grateful to the jury for affirming the rule of law. It was never a matter of revenge. It was a matter of justice. I hope this outcome reminds everyone, no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge." In the days that followed, the impact of the trial was palpable. Denton was fired from the police force and faced additional internal investigations into previous complaints. Pratt/Who was more cooperative with the investigation / received a lighter sentence, but also lost his position. The city council announced a review of police practices to prevent similar incidents in the future. For Ali, life at the Pentagon was back to normal, but with a new sense of purpose. The Secretary of Defense himself congratulated her on her bravery, hinting at the prospect of a promotion. Ali accepted the praise with restraint, realizing that her case was only a drop in the ocean, and many in her situation did not have the same resources and support. Nevertheless, the victory felt significant not only for her, but also for the system in which she worked. Each day as she walked into the Pentagon building, she held her head up higher, knowing that she would continue to fight for justice wherever possible. What about Denton and Pratt? They were a living reminder of the consequences of the abuse of power. It was said that Denton couldn't find work, his reputation ruined. Pratt left for another state and hoping to start over. but neither man could escape the consequences of their actions. Exactly 1 month after the verdict, Aaliyah found herself back in an Arlington courtroom. But not for a new hearing, but to participate in a public forum on police reform. The city council had invited her to speak. Aaliyah Johnson stood before an audience gathered in the city council chamber. Rows of wooden benches were occupied by local politicians, by bias activists, and ordinary citizens interested in the upcoming reforms. Media cameras worked silently, capturing every word. Although the excitement surrounding her trial had died down, her story still preoccupied people's minds. When Aaliyah took the microphone, there was silence in the hall. She spoke briefly about her unlawful arrest, not dwelling on the details, but emphasizing how bias and lack of control lead to situations like this. She then turned to the broader problem, the lack of anti-discrimination training, the reluctance to prosecute police officers with multiple complaints, and weak monitoring mechanisms. "I've served my country all my life," she said firmly. "At the Pentagon, mistakes can cost lives and jeopardize national security. Law enforcement must have the same rigid accountability. We cannot allow negligence and bias because the cost is too high. It undermines people's trust and jeopardizes those we are supposed to protect." The hall exploded with applause. Aaliyah concluded her speech by calling on the city council to implement reforms, more transparency in investigations, mandatory anti-bias training, and police community collaboration. After the forum, a young girl with shining eyes approached her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Your story gives hope that one person's voice can make a difference." Aaliyah smiled. She remembered the night she had been roughly pushed into the police car and the fear that had gripped her then. Now she stood here, using her experience for change. It might have ended differently if she hadn't had support. In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah dove headfirst into her work. With geopolitical tensions rising, her duties at the Pentagon became even more important. She led working groups, developed strategies, and contributed to decisions that shaped the nation's defense policy. But the events in the courtroom stayed with her forever, reminding her to fight for justice not only globally, but also in her hometown. One day she was summoned to her office by Colonel McKnight. At his desk sat Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, 3/3/, greeting her with a wide smile. Aaliyah's heart twitched. "Ms. Johnson/Austin began. You have shown extraordinary dedication not only to your work, but also to the principles of justice. We have been following your work on cybersecurity initiatives, and we believe you are ready for a new challenge." Colonel McKnight handed her a folder. Inside was an offer of appointment to the position of Deputy Director of Strategic Operations. It was an important and influential position. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she read the document and tears began to gather in her eyes. "Yeah. I don't even know what to say." She breathed out. "I'm honored." "You deserve it." Austin nodded. "We need leaders who are not only brilliant at their jobs, but who uphold the principles of honor and justice. Your courage in a difficult moment has shown that it is people like you who move this country forward." Aaliyah could hardly contain her emotions. "Thank you. I accept the offer." That night, after sharing the news with her mother over the phone, Aaliyah sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window. The silhouette of the Pentagon was visible against the nighttime Washington/D. C. Skyline. Once, one unjust arrest had nearly ruined her life. Now it had become a point of growth, proving that resilience and integrity could change not only the fate of individuals, but entire systems. Tomorrow, new responsibilities and new challenges awaited her, but Aaliyah was ready. She realized that real strength was not in rank and position, but in the courage to do the right thing, even when the system resisted it. And that was the kind of strength she would carry with her from the corridors of the Pentagon to any corner of the country where justice needed a protector.